Hello, welcome to our Faith, Justice, and Reparations in Evanston workshop series. Adam, I just need to let you know, this is a conversation to our tech people for a minute, that we have a number of people who've been saying they cannot get in using the link. I have resent the link to those folks, and my hope is that that will let them get in, but I'm not quite sure why they would have trouble using the link and getting in at this point. Anything you can do to support us would be helpful. Okay, so we want to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy fall afternoon, a beautiful fall afternoon here in Evanston, to join us for some education, exploration, and conversation. We know people are busy and that you could be doing a number of other things right now. But we are grateful that you chose to be here. We have about 150 registrants for this seminar, so there are a lot of people on, and 73 at this point in time. So we want to ask you to greet each other by using the chat and writing in your name and perhaps your faith affiliation or other affiliation that brings you here today. And that way you can kind of get a chance to introduce yourselves to each other via chat. And you can do that while I'm introducing the session. So I want to take a minute to recognize and thank all of the people who worked to make the workshop possible. It started with a small group of congregants from the Unitarian Church of Evanston. And this group wanted a way to address questions raised and curiosity expressed about reparations by UCE members. After conversations with Interfaith Action, the group expanded to include congregants from 4 other Evanston churches: Lake Street Church, Sherman United Methodist Church, St. Luke's Episcopal Church, and Northminster Presbyterian. And then the work began. A special thank you to UCE for spearheading the work and hosting this event, to Sarah Vanderwicken for leading the team, to Brian and Carol Nielsen for creating the website, to Joseph Kent for graphic design, and UCE's tech wizard, Adam, who's managing our Zoom meeting today, Jessica, UCE's staff support. We know that all of you visited the website to register, but make sure to check out the resources page for continued learning and resources for moving forward. My name's Jackie Eddy. I'm a member at Northminster Presbyterian Church and have been a resident of Evanston for almost 40 years. I will be facilitating the sessions. So first, a few logistics. Each session's 90 minutes long, and they are being recorded. If you don't want to be recorded, you'll need to keep your camera off and your microphone off. We have no scheduled breaks, so do what you have to do to care for yourself and take a break if you need one. There'll be time for questions after our featured speakers, and you'll be prompted to use the chat function to submit your questions during those presentations. Please do not otherwise use the chat after these beginning remarks unless asked to do so. And finally, a reminder that when we do have opportunities for discussion among the attendees, participants are expected to use the conversation agreements that are listed here on our PowerPoint on the screen. So Adam, if you could put that up, that'd be great. Adam, the PowerPoint screen that has the conversation agreements is what we're sharing at this point. Okay, great. So our agreements in talking with each other today is to listen to one another's thoughts and opinions with respect, to listen to understand, not for agreement or disagreement, to resist interrupting, waiting for each speaker to finish their thought, to step up and step back, being willing to share your thoughts and help ensure others have the opportunity to do so. Outside of the workshop, Don't share information or stories that identify individuals or individual churches. And accept and expect discomfort and try to learn from it. So those are the agreements that we ask everybody to abide by when we do have conversations with one another. So Adam, you can take that down at this point in time. Okay, so Adam will get to it in a minute. I think he's dealing with some of these folks who can't get on. So let's just get started. Many of the inequities that we see in America today stem from what some have called America's original sin, slavery. Even after slavery was abolished, rules, laws, and institutions were established and kept people of African descent off the ladder of success. As a result, African Americans as a group currently lag in healthcare, education, job opportunities, home ownership, wealth accumulation, and any other category that contributes to upward mobility. What can be done about this, and what can we do? That's the purpose of this workshop. During our 3 sessions, we'll give a brief history of racism, explore what reparation means, show how Evanston's history of exclusion and discrimination calls for repair, learn about the current Evanston Reparations program, and consider how we as people of faith are called to act at this significant moment in history. If you joined us a little early today, you viewed a video sharing what different faith traditions and leaders in those faith traditions think about and say about reparations and racism. We'll share this video prior to the start of each session and as a wrap up. To begin today, we'd like to welcome Reverend Dr. Michael Neighbors, who will take us a little deeper into how persons of faith are called into this conversation. Dr. Neighbors is the senior pastor at Second Baptist Church in Evanston and the president of the Evanston chapter of the NAACP. He's also been very integrally involved in the thinking and planning for reparations in Evanston. Welcome, Dr. Neighbors, and thanks for being here with us.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I am happy and pleased and excited to be with you all today. I am especially excited because I think that this is a wonderful expression for the nature and the essence of Evanston, a community for all of our challenges that has never been afraid to come together and to tackle some of the difficult issues of the day and some of the promising issues of the day as well. So for today, I was asked to offer just a brief kind of background or synopsis about reparations from a religious perspective. So I want to share with you that, as has been mentioned, I've been blessed to be involved with the reparations movement in Evanston ever since a powerful City Hall meeting took place in November of 2019. That was after City Council approved Resolution 126 for reparations to be given in Evanston to the tune of $10 million. I was involved with it a little bit before then, but that's when I really did get involved. So we had decided that we would involve as much of the Black community as possible, and we called them stakeholders. We had meetings, but unfortunately, we had something called COVID that struck us in March of 2020. So all of our public community meetings were basically shelved, and we started to figure out how to meet online and Zoom as we're doing right now. I wanted to share with you that since November of 2019, I've been privileged to have a lot of interviews, over 75 interviews from different media outlets, both around Evanston and the Chicago area, but also around the world. Everybody is interested in reparations. And I want to say that personally, I've also been contacted by dozens of ministers and clergy persons from around the country asking how Evanston got its start with regard to reparations. To that end, I've been fortunate to be a guest speaker on reparations for a number of different groups, a United Methodist group of pastors at a resort area in Bayview, Michigan, in early July. Also in May, I was a guest speaker for South Bend, Indiana's Interfaith Clergy Alliance that included representatives from South Bend and from Notre Dame. I've also been involved in several interfaith discussions taking place with folks from around the country. And I want to share that, of course, every single faith that has been involved in discussion about reparations are able to go to their own sacred text and to find particular passages in their text that talk about the need for us to repair the damage of those who are in our community and neighborhood. And this idea of repair and repairing the damage is very old, and it is connected not only to Christianity and Judaism, but it's also connected to Islam, to Buddhism, to Hinduism, and so many other faiths are concerned about trying to help the least and the lowest, and concerned also about how they got into that position. So I want to also share with you that I have had an opportunity to strike up a wonderful relationship with a professor at Northwestern University, Kate Masur, who wrote a book earlier this year titled Until Justice is Done. And that book did an outline about the whole movement of civil rights between the American Revolution and the Civil War. And over again, the idea about reparations rose long before the Civil War. There were thoughts and conversations about reparations from slave owners and ex-slave owners leading up to the Revolutionary War and after it as well. And of course, the idea of reparations in the United States probably came from General Sherman of the Union Army, who after the Civil War declared that reparations would be given to all free Black men to the tune of 40 acres and a mule. That was a promise that was given for the newly freed slaves in 1865. So I want to share that from my perspective, all of the faith organizations and the houses of worship that are on this line, we are appreciative of your interest in reparations and a desire to become involved in it. One of the things that I want to share before I prepare to close is this. I want to share that Martin Luther King Jr. said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And from that perspective, what I'm trying to say is that it really is incumbent upon every community and every town in our nation to consider reparations for damages that have been done specifically to Black people in this country, those out of the African diaspora, simply because of the color of their skin. Now, reparations doesn't end there. We're also concerned about our Native American friends. We're also concerned about our Chinese Americans, Asian Americans. We're concerned about Japanese Americans. All of those persons that have experienced damage due to discrimination. We need to think about what reparations means to get them not only in the race, but to get them into the race so that they can be a success for themselves individually and for their families as well. And in closing, I also want to share with you that communities around the nation have contacted folks from reparations here in Evanston. I've been contacted by folks in High Point, North Carolina. Asheville, North Carolina is also beginning a reparations program. Kalamazoo, Michigan is looking into it. Milwaukee, Wisconsin, closer to home, Chicago, Illinois, all over the country, people are saying, what can we do to begin to right the wrongs that people of color have suffered, not just since 1865, but since they first arrived on the shores of this North American continent in 1619. So I'm proud to be a part of this, looking forward to it. And let me say this, I believe in this saying with all of my heart. We may not have it all together, but together we have it all. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to be together with you all on this call today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Reverend Neighbors, for starting us off today by running the conversation in faith and sharing your experience around reparations. So in addition to grounding the conversation in faith, we need to ground the conversation in history. While there's always more to learn, most of us have some idea about the realities of slavery and its aftermath. So we're not going to take much time today to go over that history, but we do need to take a few moments to remind ourselves of what the experience of Black people has been in this country, to begin our discussion of reparations and why reparations are called for. This short film, written and narrated by Brian Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama, takes us on a very fast trip from the earliest moments of the slave trade to mass incarceration and the police violence of today. It's mostly oriented to the experience of people in the South and does not cover housing segregation or other forms of discrimination more associated with the North and the West. But keep those in mind as you watch the film and think about the long-term effects of the experience still unfolding of Black people throughout this country. So Adam, if you can go ahead and show the film.
In 1619, when the first Africans were brought to the British colonies by ship to Jamestown, Virginia, they held the legal status of servant. But as the region's economic system became increasingly dependent on forced labor, we descended into slavery. The institution of American slavery developed as a permanent, hereditary system centrally tied to race. Millions of Black people were forcibly taken from Africa, crammed on ships and brought to the Americas through a dangerous and deadly journey that crossed the Atlantic. Millions died. Once on our shores, slavery deprived the enslaved person of any legal rights or autonomy, and granted the slave owner complete power over the Black men, women, and children legally recognized as property. An ideology of white supremacy, a narrative of racial difference was created to rationalize and justify the continuation of slavery. American slavery was often brutal, barbaric, and violent. In addition to the hardship of forced labor, enslaved people were maimed or killed by slave owners as punishment for working too slowly, visiting a spouse living on another plantation, or even learning to read. Enslaved people were also sexually exploited. The United States Congress finally banned the importation of slaves from Africa in 1808. Slavery was widely considered a gross human rights violation, yet enslavement was retained and persisted. The 1808 Declaration caused the demand for slave labor to skyrocket in the Lower South, and the domestic slave trade grew to meet this demand. Between 1808 and 1860, the enslaved population of Alabama grew from less than 40,000 to more than 435,000. Slave traders chained African Americans together in couples and forced them to march hundreds of miles from the Upper South to the Lower South. Steamboats carried slaves along the Alabama River. Rail routes constructed with slave labor brought hundreds of enslaved people to Montgomery, Alabama every day, turning the city into one of the largest slave trading communities in the United States. Enslaved people would be paraded up Commerce Street to slave warehouses and slave depots. The city's slave market was at the Artesian Basin, now known as Court Square. Enslaved people of all ages were auctioned along with livestock, standing in line to be inspected. Public posters advertising the sale of slaves included gender, age, skill, complexion, owner's name, and price. Slavery in America traumatized and devastated millions of people. Husbands and wives, parents and children could not protect themselves from being sold away from each other. Enslaved families were separated at an owner's or auctioneer's whim, never to see each other again. The domestic slave trade separated nearly half of all enslaved people from their spouses and parents. In 1833, the Alabama legislature banned free black people from residing in the state, meaning that enslavement was the only legally authorized status for African Americans. Even as the Civil War raged, slave trading in Montgomery flourished well into the mid-1860s. After the Confederacy's surrender in 1865, Congress passed the 13th Amendment, which prohibited slavery nationwide except as a punishment for crime. But in many former slave states, slavery did not end. It simply evolved. Southern whites, angry after losing the war, targeted black people who were largely abandoned by the federal government in the 1870s. For decades, black men, women, and children were tortured, terrorized, and killed by mobs and violent lynchings, oppressed by a system of racist laws and customs. For another 100 years, black people were racially segregated, denied the right to vote, education, and basic dignity. They were humiliated, beaten, or killed for minor offenses or for protesting. The civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s helped to end legally authorized racial segregation, but racial bias still persists. Today, a presumption of guilt is assigned to many people of color who are disproportionately arrested, convicted of crimes, and sent to prison. African Americans are 6 times more likely to be sentenced to prison for the same crime as a white person. 1 in 3 black males born today can expect to spend time in prison during his lifetime. Police violence against black people is so epidemic that civil rights demonstrations have shut down cities across the U.S. as thousands of people march to protest police brutality. Many states celebrate the era of slavery with Confederate holidays and by honoring the defenders and architects of slavery while ignoring the history of enslavement. The Equal Justice Initiative believes that racial bias remains a serious problem and is a direct and lasting legacy of American slavery and our failure to deal with the history of racial injustice. The Equal Justice Initiative seeks to foster an honest conversation about the legacy of slavery, about mass incarceration, and racial inequality and how it still affects millions of people today. We can confront and overcome bias and discrimination. Please join us in this conversation so that we can move forward together.
Okay, so as familiar as this history is, you may have learned a couple of new things from the video. We asked you to think about the long-term effects of what you were seeing in the video and otherwise know about the history of racism. Now we're going to do an activity together and try to capture those effects in a word cloud. In a moment, you'll find a link in the chat to a website, www.menti.com. There'll also be a code that you will need to enter once you're on the site. Please copy down that code. In a moment, not yet, but once you're on the site, you'll be asked to give a 1 or 2 word answer to this question. What do you think are the long-lasting effects of racism in this country? Consider effects on individuals, communities, institutions, the nation. Consider effects on white people, Black people, and other people of color. We'll see what emerges in the word cloud, in which the most commonly observed effects are transformed into the largest words. So now go ahead and click on that link and go to www.menti.com. Enter the code and let's see what we create together. Again, do it in short 1 or 2 words of what you think are the long-lasting effects of racism on this country. Adam, just verifying that the code is 2425561.
Correct.
Thank you. Enter 1 or 2 or 3 responses, and we'll see it grow on the screen. Once you've entered your responses, you can go ahead and close your Menti window or tab if it opened a new tab for you, and you'll be able to see the word cloud grow. If you do have trouble navigating the site, you can go ahead and type your words into the chat, your 1 or 2 word answers into the chat, and one of our team will enter them for you into the Menti application. Well, you can see as things are emerging from this group of 80 or so people on the call, that inequity and poverty, trauma, shame are some of the top things people have entered. Hopelessness, injustice, separation. Dehumanization, shame, fear. Yet I'm assuming that as it changes, it means more people are entering things. Great. So we're seeing that live kind of addition, lack of opportunity, hopelessness. So I believe we'll be able to save this word cloud that we've created together and share it with you at a later time. Let's take a minute and a moment to review a few revealing statistics. So Adam, we're going to look at the slides that have the stats up. Thank you for participating in that activity with. Okay, so the first slide, average life expectancy. You can go forward, Adam. Average life expectancy in Chicago, Streeterville is 90 years. Looks like we need to sort this out and make sure we can pull up the slides. So we'll take a minute. Okay, great. Average life expectancy in Chicago, Streeterville is 90 years, only 9 miles away. In the predominantly Black South Side, it drops to 60 years. The Black rate of COVID-19 hospitalizations is more than twice as high as the white rate. This clearly kind of reveals health and wellness discrepancies. The average life expectancy, I'm sorry, next slide, there we go. 9 out of 10 members of the public violently confronted by the police in Chicago are Blacks or Latinos. And African Americans are incarcerated in state prisons across the country at more than 5 times the rate of whites. So policing and justice disparities. During the COVID-19 crisis, rates of food insecurity among Black households with children are nearly twice as high as they are among white households. And in 2018, the poverty rate for white households in Illinois was 8.4%. It was 23.8% for Black households and 14.9% for Hispanics. So economic disparities. And the median wealth for a Black family is $24,100, while median wealth for white families stands at $188,200. Under 7% of white home mortgage applicants are denied loans. Denials for Black Americans are over 16%. So disparities in the ability to build wealth. Thanks, Adam. So as we can see, there's much need for repair. So just what is this idea of reparations and what should reparations consist of? At this time, I'm pleased to introduce Woolard Lett, the Education Commission co-chair of the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, commonly known by its acronym NCOBRA. And COBRA is the premier mass-based coalition of organizations and individuals in the United States organized for the sole purpose of obtaining reparations for African descendants in America. It was founded in 1987. Mr. Lett is also co-chair of the Manchester, New Hampshire NAACP and a regional leader for the Unitarian Universalist Association. He has a long history of study, public speaking, and activism within the spiritual and political Black and anti-racist community. And we're thrilled that he could join us today. Welcome, Bullard.
Thank you. Thank you, Jackie. And thank you also to all of the participants that are here today. It's quite an honor for me to join you and to share with you a few ideas about reparations. So I'll start out, and I'm focusing on local reparations today. And I've titled my presentation, Local Reparations, The Road to Full Repair. One of the things I wanted to do from the very beginning is just clarify, well, what do we mean by reparations, to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. And actually, reparations means repair. Reparations is, it doesn't mean revenge, it means repair. And reparations is not about a broken hiring contract where someone's labor was stolen. It's about a broken human covenant where the peoplehood, the very personhood of a people were, stolen and degraded through this process of African chattel slavery. So when we're talking about reparations, we're talking about repair, and we're talking about repairing the human covenant. One of the questions that often comes up when we talk about reparations is, well, okay, what is the problem we're trying to solve? And the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America identified 5 injury areas that resulted from African chattel slavery here in the US. And those are peoplehood or nationhood, which speaks to the very humanity of African people. In fact, when the Unitarian Thomas Jefferson wrote those high-minded, high-sounding words that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, he was alienating those exact same rights from African people. We watched a brief video that talked a little bit about all the egregious harms visited upon African people. And we saw where they talked about how people were not allowed to have families, to, they were treated as property. And so that is identified in the injury area of peoplehood or nationhood. A second area is education. African people, since they've arrived here in the Americas, and in the 1619 in the British colonies here in the Americas, have been awash in a sea of misinformation and disinformation. And even then were denied access, denied the right to educate themselves or to be educated. That much of that, the residue, the vestiges of those policies we see today in underfunding of educational institutions that are directed or geared to support people of African descent. The area of health is a severe major injury area. We know about, and the studies have been done on both Confederate soldiers who were in the Civil War, as well as survivors, Jewish survivors and other survivors of concentration camps in Nazi Germany, on the impact of that experience, that traumatic adverse experience had on those people and their descendants. It's a study of the science of epigenetics. And African people, since they've arrived here in this country, have been subject to trauma. There was a book written several years ago called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And the challenge with that title is that the trauma hasn't ended. We can't get to post-traumatic because the trauma is live and active and real. We saw it on television, with George Floyd. But George Floyd is just one instance. And that trauma provides both mental and physical health impacts and effects. A fourth area of injury is criminal punishment. And we say criminal punishment because there is no justice in the American penal and corrections and law enforcement system, by and large, for people of African descent. In fact, we know that the history of policing traces back to a time in American history where municipalities and others formed groups to pursue and hunt down enslaved African people who were fighting and refusing for their liberty to be denied. And finally, wealth and poverty. We all know, we saw the numbers that were shared in the statistics just a minute ago. In fact, the Boston Federal Reserve Bank did a study in the Boston area and found out that the median income for Boston residents who were melanin deficient of European descent was $200,000. And those Boston residents who were melanin enhanced of African descent, their median income was $8. So, it's, and that's in Boston. Imagine what the numbers would look like in Mississippi. It couldn't be too much better. So those are the 5 injury areas that Nkobo looks at when we start talking about reparations or repair. A repair of a people, who have been injured by parties, whether they're government or corporations. So if that's the injury, then what can we do? I'm certain some people are wondering, it sounds a little overwhelming, and is there, can't we just start over from where we are now? When we look at international law, we see 5 remedies. And those 5 remedies that international law provides restitution. Restitution talks about restoring the people back to their former status prior to the injury, the incident that happens. The international law and the UN definition of reparations includes compensation. Compensation is an element of reparations, but it's not, the whole of reparations. Compensation is necessary, but is insufficient for full repair. We also, in addition to restitution and compensation, we also need rehabilitation. And that's hearkening back to the point that was made earlier about both the physical and the mental injuries that result from this mistreatment. They must be addressed. Fourthly, satisfaction. Satisfaction in some ways addresses education because it says people need to be told the truth about what happened. Governments need to take action to both memorialize what happened and educate people with plaques, with statues, with information. In addition to that, government also has the responsibility for cessation, meaning ceasing whatever the problem, these injuries and their vestiges that are going on. I'm a fairly young man. I just recently turned 65. And in my lifetime, I've heard people talk about people of African descent have been struggling against mistreatment for years. When is it going to end? How are we going to stop it? Can we actually make a difference? There is a role for the government to participate in repairing this broken human covenant through practices identified as cessation. And finally, the fifth remedy offered by the international community when it talks about reparations is a guarantee of non-repeat. And all of us, I'm sure that as I look out on the audience, and I see the enlightened and learned participants who are here today with me, probably half of you could do this presentation that I'm doing. But one of the things that we know is, as we look back at the Civil Rights Acts of the 1870s that were passed to preserve the rights of African people were overturned and subverted. The Civil Rights Acts of the 1965 of 1960s that were again passed to preserve and protect the rights of African people were overturned and subverted. And so this idea of guarantee of non-repeat is addressing that same issue of how privilege mutates and takes on new forms to preserve itself. So, in my attempt to kind of make sense of this, I've attempted to match the injury with the remedy area. And it's not a one-to-one, but, it gives us something to think about. And the injury of peoplehood or nationhood, which is culture and personhood, is addressed somewhat by the remedy of restitution, restoring a people to their former self. One of the myths and some of the misinformation that Europeans have produced over the years is that Africa was a, cultureless, barren place with no, guidance or development. And that's a lie. And that's wrong. And, restitution takes us in the direction of addressing that. The injury of education, to some degree, is addressed by the remedy of satisfaction, information about what happened. Health, the area of health, the injury area of health is addressed through the remedy, the international reparations remedy of rehabilitation. Criminal punishment, again, is addressed by this idea of the guarantee of non-repeat, where it's articulated much more fully in the UN Declaration. And finally, the injury area of wealth and poverty is covered by the remedy compensation. Now, the reality is that all of these injuries exist at some level within, both parties, both the injured and the injurer. And however, the remedies need to be matched with the severity of the injury, both the nature and severity of the injury. So, when we talk about reparations and repair, it's not, you can't have to be repaired, you can't have a little bit of repair and consider it repaired. And at the risk of causing some offense, I'll just say that it's like being a little bit pregnant. You either are or you aren't. And with repair, either you are or you aren't. However, there are stages. And so what Nkobo talks about is full repair. Now, one of the things that I want to say is that we live in a society, this European, Eurocentric society, that is very low context and very binary in terms of the way that it thinks. I'll give a couple of examples to explain what I mean. First I'll say that oftentimes I've found in my short time on the planet that our greatest strength can also be our greatest weakness. And in European history, there was a period called the Enlightenment that came that provided a method for engaging the natural world. And that was very low context, meaning that the scientific method said, it should work. If you do it, it should work. If I do it, it should work. The person that's doing it is not the factor. That's, it's not the context, it's the content, it's what actually happens. And also the thinking included this kind of thinking that was partly based on hierarchy, but it's also, you can only be one thing. Either it is or it isn't. You're good or you're bad. And so when we look at reparations, we can't afford to adopt those ways of thinking as we attempt to break out of an old mold. Our friend Albert Einstein said, you can't solve a problem at the same level of thinking that created it. So if low context binary thinking created the problem of the breach in the human covenant, we can't use that kind of thinking to repair it. For full repair, it requires us to do many things. Some of those things are definitely necessary, but only by themselves, they may be insufficient for full repair. And one example of that is compensation. Compensation is definitely necessary, but in and of itself, if that's the only thing you do, that's insufficient for full repair. So when we talk about full repair, we're talking about involving government. Government had a part in the problem that was created through laws and public policies, and government has a role in their resolution. Social institutions, churches and religious institutions, educational institutions. While we look to churches as being sources of inspiration and moral guidance, they are. But they're more than that. They're not just one thing. We want to look at them in a holistic way, and they oftentimes serve the interests of those who are sometimes who are funding them. Actually, educational institutions. We talk about education as the great equalizer, and it will lift us all up. But much of what we call education ends up being miseducation, and in those instances, we see examples of that where the educational institutions were used to create justifications for the dehumanization of the African personality and the European imagination. Corporations. We have corporations that were created on the backs of enslaved African people. The insurance industry. We talk about Wall Street being a international financial juggernaut, and it cut its teeth through its engagement with African chattel slavery. Also, when we talk about government, we got to look at it on a number of different levels. When we start talking about full repair, there's national government and national policies that were in place. We talked about how we can look at how certain kinds of national legislative policies as well as court rulings have supported and protected African chattel slavery over the years. Then there's state level policies where state legislators, legislatures, and actions have both promoted and supported African chattel slavery. And finally, at the municipal level, at the city level, there have been, we can cite policies and practices that supported both African chattel slavery and the vestiges. How many of you are familiar with the term sundown towns? If you are, then you know what I'm talking about, and you know what I mean in relationship to talking about municipal policies. And if you aren't familiar with the term sundown towns, Google it, look it up. It'll be an educational experience. And finally, with my work in the reparations movement, there is a growing awareness of the need for, as part of full repair, for personal accountability and responsibility. Where folk, when they look at their family wealth and they think back and they say like, oh, well, we're self-made. We came here to this country and we had nothing, and look at what we have now, without a full appreciation of the systems and the practices that punish some and privilege others and allows for that kind of growth and development for some while denying it to others. So when we think about this, and we think about, well, how does local reparations fit into this, I want to check my time, okay? Or fit into this arrangement? How does it conceptually fit into this worldview? Well, I want to talk a little bit about the criteria for local reparations. And when I say that, the criteria is like, well, what constitutes local reparations and what needs to be there as part of it? And as you see from the slide, I've listed a few things. One, a criteria for something to be considered local reparations, it has to have the affected party or group define the remedy. The enslaver can't come and tell the enslaved, what the enslaver needs to do in order to make things right. But those who have been injured, those who have, in this case, enslaved and or suffered the vestiges of that, need to define the remedy that's required. Because through defining the remedy, they're also defining the injury. Another element of a criteria for local reparations is that there needs to be an independent body to administer the remedy. And that independent body would be controlled by the affected, impacted party or group. Somewhere along here else, I talk about that a little bit more, but I'll just say for the time being. And finally, for local reparations to meet, a local reparations effort to meet the criteria, it would also have to address a specific past harm. There are a lot of policies that need to happen that would help everybody. They talked about baby bonds. People have talked about a living, not exactly, they didn't call it a living wage, but a permanent wage for everyone. And those are admirable goals. But for it to be reparations, for it to be repair for an injury that occurred, it needs to be specific and address a specific past harm. So then, if those are the criteria, then what's the basis for that criteria? Well, for the affected party or group to be the one to define the remedy, that should be the case, because as you see here, I use this wisdom saying that the fox can't guard the hen house. The people who did the plunder, the people who created the injury, cannot be the same folk who define how they could and should be held accountable for that. The idea that an independent body should administer the remedy means that there are policies and practices in place that within institutions that don't require the intention of an individual in order to carry out those ends. And so we need to create new institutions that aren't part of the offending party institutions to do this important work. And, the independent body should be controlled by the affected group. Partly because reparations is defined in a way that there is an injury, and part of the process of healing the injury, part of the process of providing the remedy is to, we talked about restitution, building back the capacity that was taken away from folk in the process, through the injury. And so having the control of the independent body that's going to administer the remedy be by and through the affected party or group creates that kind of capacity and provides the kind of restitution that addresses those kind of issues. And finally, by addressing a specific past harm, we're targeting the activity to actually address a actual injury rather than providing a general public good, which general public good should be instituted. But by doing that, that's not reparations. The reparations is a separate piece. So as we think about reparations, one of the things, and we think about the history of reparations, we see that shortly, the minister earlier today in his welcome and initial comments mentioned Special Field Order number 15 that was issued by General Tecumseh Sherman that allocated 40 acres to formerly enslaved families, people in Georgia and South Carolina shortly after the Civil War, and which was amended by an additional order to include a mule, the use of a mule. And this was actually passed by Congress as a federal policy. And the president at the time, Andrew Johnson, vetoed that bill, so it was never enacted. There was also created after the U.S. Civil War, something called the Freedmen's Bureau that included, social service agencies and a bank. And after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln and the election or the ascendancy of Andrew Johnson into the presidency, those efforts faltered. In fact, a major source, when we look at history, we can point to a major source of income inequality was the money that was squandered and lost by the Freedmen's Bank, along with the collapse, during the collapse of the Freedmen's Bureau. And finally, in contemporary times, the demand for reparations reemerged. The demand for reparations never went away. And I got a whole separate presentation on that. But in contemporary times, it reemerged in the late 80s through the work of the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America and the resulting federal legislation that came to move the federal government forward towards providing reparations called H.R. 40. So local reparations identify specific injuries. If it's a local reparations effort, it needs to be specific about what it's doing and why. Local reparations address those injuries with specific remedies. It creates institutions for redress, and it creates policies for reform. And the reason that this is so important, one of the reasons why local reparations efforts are so important is because they create capacity within communities to move that community and society forward for this general national reparations effort. Because reparations and repair needs to happen at many different levels because the injuries occurred at many different levels, And so one of the things that there is some controversy about sometimes is regardless of the nature of the work, there's sometimes a question about whether or not it's really reparations because it doesn't do everything that needs to be done. Well, that's part of that binary thinking. It's either like, this one thing cures everything or it's nothing. Well, there are many steps on the journey and there are many activities and actions that we need to take that are necessary for us to take, but by themselves alone are insufficient for full reparations. So one of the things that we have to do is to have that kind of vision that will not allow the people impacted or the demand to perish. We got to have the vision so we can move forward and we can incorporate the various kinds of efforts that are out there. As I mentioned, there's also a movement for personal reparations, which, I mean, definitely are not adequate to meet all the needs that are there as a result of the injuries suffered by people of African descent from African chattel slavery and its vestiges. But, sometimes some of those things are necessary, and by themselves, they may be insufficient. But collectively, we understand that we're looking for full repair, then we can see how these various steps may fit into the larger framework that is required in order for us to successfully pursue the healing of the broken human covenant that was represented by African chattel slavery. So I think I came in under my timeline, and I'll be on the call for, we'll get a chance to talk more. And with that, I'll turn it back to Jackie.
Thank you so much, Bullard, for that presentation. We're going to take some questions from the group, and I've invited Lynn, who's on our team, to she's been watching the chat, to kind of bring those forward to you so you have an opportunity to answer a few of the questions that appeared up on the chat as you were speaking.
Yes, I think there are two questions that would be good for this particular part of the presentation. One question is, could you please give specific examples of how the affected group has worked together to define the remedy?
Specifically for African chattel slavery, there have been a number of different proposed remedies for its impact, the impact of African chattel slavery and its vestiges. And by and large, I would almost say none, but there has been no large-scale adoption of those plans. And so much of the effort and energy around reparations for African chattel slavery here in the U.S. has been geared towards education and information, working to establish the need or the righteousness of the claim. There are, and one of the things that I didn't include in the presentation was this idea that, there are both internal and external reparations that need to happen, and both parties need to be repaired. So there's some repair work that needs to happen within the community of people who are melanin deficient, the people of European descent. They have some work that they need to do. And some of that work is internal work, only work that they can do within their community. Some of that work is external work. But then the African people within the community of people who are melanin enhanced, of African descent, there is some work that needs to happen. We as a society and are injured and broken and still suffering from the effects and the impact of this broken human covenant that was happening and that was created. So even among people of African descent who are melanin enhanced, there are some things that that community has to do internally that nobody else can really fix for them. They got to fix for themselves. And in addition to those things that they may need resources from the outside, external reparations as well. So, that's part of the challenge. And finally, I'll say, oftentimes people ask this question, start talking about African people, about, well, what's the answer? Willard, you're talking about there's a problem. Tell me the answer. And if you can't tell me the answer, then why are we talking about the problem? Part of the challenge that we're faced with is that we work together to create the answer. And that's why we're on this call today. I will say that I feel like there's the answer to the question is, we can, is that we have to work together to create what we need for the future. Looking back in the past, we can talk about efforts that have started and that have been undermined. We can talk about things like COINTELPRO and American political prisoners and, I mean, all of this stuff. But where we are now is where we need to be in order to work together to move forward.
Well, as a follow-up, we have a question. How can a non-effective group support the effective group authoring the remedy?
The thing is that in, the way that we think, which is really good for a lot of the material and physical sciences, is such that you can only do one thing, you can only be one thing. So it's like, we're in this relationship, this abusive relationship where we have an injured party, and that injured party comes out the room, with a black eye and a broken arm, and you put a splint on the arm and makeup under the eye and, send them back in the room. And the abuser wants to say, well, you've been beat up pretty bad. How can I help? It's like, no, there is work to be done in both communities. And the issue that we're raising is a justice issue. It's not a charity issue. How do you help, the victims of African chattel slavery and its vestiges? This, poor community has been beat up so bad. No, it's not about charity. It's about justice. So what needs to happen in order to bring justice? One of the things that people talk about now is that as we talk about social relations in the US, is how in the 70s and 80s, there was an urban heroin epidemic, and the people who were users were criminalized. They were, as they were referred to as Black and brown people. There were people who were melanin enhanced, and their behavior was criminalized. They're criminals, they have low moral character. But then we had this opioid explosion that happened, in the suburbs and in the rural areas, and among people who are melanin deficient, primarily white. And all of a sudden, heroin use was a public health issue. Well, it was always a public health issue. It was never a criminal thing. So the same kind of thing, just we have to approach this collectively as a justice issue. And that's how the non-affected party can help, by approaching this as a justice issue.
Okay, here's one last question before we move on. And the person writes, should we be optimistic right now about the future of local reparations in the United States? It seems that a lot of cities promise to take action and then seem to be very slow in enacting change or limit what they're doing to erecting statues or giving minimal numbers of scholarships. And taking away statues.
Yes. I heard what you said, and I translated into exactly that. And when we look at the United Nations definition of the remedies offered as part of reparations, those actions are covered in the area they call satisfaction. And that those things are not enough by themselves alone, but they're part of the solution. We fall into that low context binary thinking when we throw out the good, to throw out the baby with the bathwater. It's not full repair. There's more work to be done, but that work, the work that's being done, is part of the work that must be done, in order for us to reach the goal that we want. And so, a major challenge that we face and that I seem to see in my work is just helping people to recognize like some of the a priori, worldviews and conceptual frameworks they use when we approach this, approach the work that we do. When we start talking about binary and low context stuff, we look around and we see that the same thing that led to the dehumanization of the African personality and the European imagination also led to things like, the binary of what do you call plantation agriculture, where you have only one thing, just one crop, everything. We look at lawns now, or even gardens. And if you have a plant that you didn't plant there yourself, It's like, oh, well, that's not even, that's a weed. It's outside of the, the context. And that happened with people as well. That was part of how the thinking that led to the dehumanization of the African personality in the European imagination. So that we recognize the human condition, and we know that, sometimes, usually change is slow until it reaches a certain momentum. And so, I mean, we don't have a reason necessarily to be, I forget the question, like, we don't have a reason to be happy about what's happening, but we don't have a reason to be, to fall into despair. What we have to do is, just like those of us who continue to push for justice have done, is to continue the push. And that's how we get there. There's an African saying, you eat an elephant one mouthful at a time. And reparations is quite an elephant.
Do we have time for any more?
I think we're going to move ahead, Lynn, and thank you so much, Willard, for your leadership role in reparations education and COBRA, and for us, and for taking the time to be with us today to share this information. It's very enlightening. So thank you so much for your time. Great. So we're going to just do a quick look at some reparations, things that have happened in terms of reparations. It's not a new idea, as Willard said, and there are reparation demands that have been made over the years and recently. And so this short chronological video that we're going to look at is showing many of the attempts to obtain reparations by Black citizens in this country. So Adam, you can go ahead and pull that up and roll the video.
Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long way from home. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long way from home. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long way from home. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long way from home. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long way from home. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long way from home. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long way from home. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long way from home.
Okay, so we're running up to our time here, but we do want to do a very quick breakout room. We're going to break you into a very short breakout room. So 5 minutes is all you're going to have in these rooms. And really what we want you to do is, first of all, identify somebody who can kind of capture the discussion. And then that person will be entering information into chat when you come back. And our questions for your breakout room is, what did you learn today that surprised you? And what further questions do you have? And so we'll put those questions in the chat right now. And then Adam's going to go ahead and break you up into breakout rooms. And again, it's a short time, so we'll be seeing you back here in about 5 minutes.
Is that about 4 people per room, Jackie?
That's right. Again, what did you learn today that surprised you? What other questions do you have? Okay, so we are back and you can see each other. So that's really fun. There's, as I said, about 90 of you now on this attending. So welcome and so glad to see all of you. I just want to briefly say that our second session is scheduled for next week, starting at 4 o'clock, and we're going to be looking at how did we get here. So we're going to be having a focus on the harm that was done and how did it happen in Evanston. And Dino Robinson, who's the founder of Shorefront, will be our presenter from the Legacy Center in Evanston. So how housing discrimination and other discriminations have led to wealth and other inequities in our community. And then we're going to have a faith leader panel. The panel is going to be moderated by Reverend Eileen Wiviat from UCE, and it'll include Rabbi Andrea London from Beth Emmet, Pastor Deborah Scott from Ebenezer ME, and Michael Wolf from Lake Street. So we'll hope to see you all there. I think it's going to be a great program. In addition, there is some pre-work information. We're going to be sending out a follow-up email with the links to the pre-work. So if there's things that you want to look at and things before the sessions to educate yourself a little bit. And you can also find them on the website when you go to the session 2 page. So I'd like right now to invite Reverend Neighbors back to close this first session. So we need to Adam, find him, highlight him, so he can be sharing with his closing remarks. There he is. So we can see you, but not yet hear you, I guess, Reverend Neighbors.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I was trying to get unmuted. Thank you all so much for this amazing 1.5 hours. You all have been wonderful, and what a robust and amazing agenda for this initial discussion on reparations. Keep in mind that, you know, it is just a tiny fragment. We've been talking about reparations in this country for a long, long time, hundreds of years. So we have just 1.5 hours of it. And again, we're grateful for those houses of worship that have played a major role in putting this together. They've already been named. And I'm just honored to be a part of this discussion and a part of the ongoing discussion about reparations in the United States as well as in Evanston. So we're going to learn a lot more from Dino next week and from the amazing panel discussion of ministers that Reverend Wiviat is going to lead. So we're grateful for that. So I think what I'd like to do is just close out in a prayer, and we'll go from there. So loving and merciful and kind God, how excellent is your name in all of the earth. We come now thanking you for the wonder and treasure of this golden moment of being able to build new relationships, of being able to create new friendships, and of course, being concerned about the issue of justice in our land and among our people in the here and now. We pray that you would bless every single house of worship represented on this line tonight, every single household, every single person. We thank you for allowing our minds to expand, allowing our hearts to deepen, allowing our souls to be touched by the story that needs to be told. We pray that you would bless us now as we leave this call, but never thy presence. It is in your holy name that we pray. Amen. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all so much. Yes.
Have a great evening, everybody, and we'll see you next week.
Okay. Take care, everybody.